This story, this parable, it sounds so contemporary. Doesn't it feel like it just happened yesterday? So there we are, a dishonest manager is about ready to lose his job because he's been misspending his employer's assets. And because he either can't or won't or doesn't want to either do manual labor or receive charity, he goes around to all the people who owe money to his employer and reduces their debts. He does this so that these people will be friendly to him when he has lost his job. And to our surprise, the employer then commends the dishonest manager for this action, for his shrewdness in the language of the text. This parable, sometimes it's called the parable of the wicked manager, the shrewd manager, the unjust steward. Oh, and it's been making people anxious for a very, very long time. Looking at the commentary, it's often referred to as the most, and this is just a partial listing of adjectives: complicated, troubling, difficult, puzzling, problematic. Parable in the whole New Testament. So why does the employer commend the dishonest manager for giving away his assets? Well, some have argued that maybe the commendation was ironic, like how shrewd. Some have suggested that maybe the manager actually took his own commissions out of the debts that were owed, and so thereby justly adjusted the amounts that were owed. Others have tried to suggest that maybe the employer, in saying that the manager was shrewd, was noticing that he was clever and seeing after his own interests, but perhaps was not really commending the whole affair. So I don't propose to resolve all of these issues in the next 12 minutes, but I do just want to hold something up, and that is a very simple thing. Obviously, people freak out when you talk about debt reduction. I mean, doesn't it happen to you? It happens to me. I live in a pretty safe bubble. Most of my life is spent amongst you beautiful people and the people of my own congregation. Mainly, they're very thoughtful and generous, but somehow something clicks when the topic of debt forgiveness comes up. And because of President Biden's recent partial forgiveness of student loan debt, we've been having these conversations a lot. And again, the conversation will seem to be handling just fine when suddenly we'll hit a wall. And that wall happens when someone will inevitably intone in a weird robotic way, but they agreed to pay the debt. They should have to pay what they agreed to. David Graeber, the anthropologist who was one of the major thought leaders behind the Occupy movement, he wrote a whole book, Debt, History of the First 5,000 Years, simply because of his experience with running into that wall. He tells a story about being at a party at Westminster Abbey. Okay, want to be at a party at Westminster Abbey. He tells a story about being at a party in Westminster Abbey, and he's talking to a lawyer who doesn't really understand what the goals of the Occupy movement were. And so Graeber is trying to talk about how, for one thing, what they were trying to do was change the role of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, which essentially serves as the collection agency for loans to developing countries. And he was explaining how the IMF, for example, had a while back forgiven a very small loan, not forgiven, excuse me, insisted on repayment on a small loan to Madagascar. Now, this loan was very small in relationship to the bottom line of the bank that offered it, but they insisted on payment, and as a consequence, Madagascar had to stop funding their mosquito eradication program. The result was that more than 10,000 people, many of them children, died of malaria. Now, Graeber thought this was a slam dunk. that this was a slam dunk for saying there are reasons, compassionate reasons to forgive debt. Well, he ran up against that brick wall, but they said they would pay the debt. Again, in that zombie-like voice. So this wall isn't even new. You can see the wall going up inside of the text itself in the scripture. Most biblical scholars agree that the parable itself is easily attributable to the historic Jesus. But towards the end, it starts to get a little different. You might have noticed that the tone of everything from after and I tell you is a little different. It becomes frantic. It becomes moralizing. It's looking for a way to explain what the text itself apparently thinks is unexplainable. So what is this wall? What is this wall that can't be penetrated by either reason or compassion? I know that I see this wall as evidence. I see it as evidence of the degree to which we have failed to decolonize what's between our ears. And I see this wall as evidence that once more, we are being asked to confuse systemic injustice for personal failing. And we're asked to pay that price in shame. Some other things I noticed. You notice that debt forgiveness only becomes a problem. You're talking about a certain class of people. Don't you think the top 1% of the world's wealthy forgive each other's debts all the time? And couldn't some of that be happening too in this parable? We claim to be so confused about why the employer would extend this courtesy of forgiveness to the manager and not collect the full amount due. I think that's only difficult to understand if you imagine that the employer and the manager are very different social classes. I'm not sure they are. The manager seems to me to have a great deal of privilege, so much privilege. He's sure he won't need to do manual labor or accept charity. I think the employer and the manager were at least within weakening distance class-wise. And I think they were happy and accustomed to supporting each other. Did you know that some scholars, they've all been discredited, but give me a moment. That some scholars have actually claimed that religion itself is the origin of the whole concept of debt. So these folks are called primordial debt theorists, and they believe that at some misty point in human history, we conceive this idea that life has been given to us as a gift. And so therefore we're indebted to the gods. And so therefore we required religion to pay off our debts to the gods. And as this story goes, eventually monarchs decided that they could enforce this agreement on behalf of divine rule. And then only eventually did we come to have any understanding that we owe each other money. Again, it's been completely discredited, but I find it absolutely charming. And it is supported in some especially Vedic texts. Here's one I like a lot. If one wants to offer a sacrifice, you pay your debt owed to the gods. If you study a sacred text, you pay your debt owed to the saints. If you parent well, that pays your debt owed to the fathers. And if you offer hospitality, you pay your debt owed to humanity. I like it. Again, history has proven that this is not how it all went down, but is it so bad to remember, to see life as something given to us? Is it so hard to understand that that next sentiment then would be gratitude, and that following on gratitude, we would have a desire to be in service to each other? I like too how the primordial debt theory reminds us that there are always two kinds of debt. There's the primordial debt, this sense of gratitude for everything we've been given, graces completely unearned. But there's also punishing debt, which aims to make a whole subset of the population literal prisoners. Did you know that the first understanding of the word freedom, at least in ancient Sumeria, it was rendered as a return to mother? This is because in ancient Sumeria, when peasants would take loans, which they would have to do frequently, they would provide collateral in terms of their property, in terms of their animals, in terms of their household possessions. But once they ran out of collateral to offer back to those to whom they owed money, they would offer their family members. Their family members would then be taken into peonage, forced to work for the person to whom the money was owed. But here's the interesting thing about historical debt. Historical debt never existed without the parallel notion that that debt must frequently be completely forgiven. And so this idea of freedom, meaning return to mother, as that cycle of forgiveness and jubilee was achieved, then those persons held in debt peonage were free to go to their home village to return to mother. So I also notice that I think cultures who understand primordial debt are better than many other cultures about not punishing people for actual debts. So understanding this, maybe we can return to that wall that people said they were going to pay it back. Can we counter that sentiment? Can we counter it by pointing out the many primordial debts we owe to God, to the saints, to each other? Isn't the entire premise of Christianity based on this notion that we will be extended a graciousness and a forgiveness that will be far in excess of anything anyone could ever be said to owe? And while I don't think it's necessarily correct to read the manager in this parable as the Christ figure, I also notice that what was said about Jesus is said about this manager, that he was handing out forgiveness far in excess of his legal authority to do so. Didn't they mean to suggest that that too was rogue and criminal? Is that manager really dishonest? What if in all mentions of debt, what we're really acknowledging or meant to acknowledge is how deeply we're interdependent, how much our lives have never been self-derived. And if we begrudge generosity, isn't that only because we have forgotten where we stand? At the end of the day, might not the intense gratitude relief for even the smallest amount of forgiveness, might that not be our own? So God, please do forgive our debts, as we also forget our debtors.